Hello, welcome and bienvenue. My name is Louise McKinney. I'm an instructor here at Georgia Perimeter College and also a Canadian from just outside of Toronto. And I want to thank the Provost's office for hosting this event and also the sponsors who brought these wonderful writers to our campus, the Writers Institute at GPC and the Canadian Consulate General. So we're here to celebrate what I call the CANUSA connection. That's Canada plus USA, CANUSA. I like it has the word canoe in it. As it's obvious to say that Canada is America's northern neighbor, next door neighbor, but is also America's greatest trading partner. And when Maclean's magazine did a poll, they found out that 80% of Canadians knew this, but only 12% of Americans knew this fact. This is the kind of thing that makes Canadians tear their hair out, and perhaps is what prompted Canadian author Margaret Atwood to say that the Canada-U.S. border is the world's longest undefended one-way mirror. But maybe today we have hope for something a little bit different, because I see Canadians are represented in the media on programs like South Park, where they like to poke fun at us and diss Canadians. To them, I guess we're forest-dwelling, pretty much country bumpkins sometimes, a la Doug and Bob McKenzie. But I think that we need to look past these superficial representations, and we look to literature and the arts as a great river of words from which we draw understanding, and especially with literature for a more rounded depiction of what is Canada, what is a Canadian, and furthermore, what is human. Now I'm going to introduce a wonderful young writer by the name of Nino Ricci. Nino Ricci's first novel, the best-selling Lives of the Saints, garnered international acclaim, appearing in over a dozen countries and winning a host of awards, including Canada's Governor-General's Award for Fiction. The novel was followed by In a Glass House and Where She Has Gone, which completed the trilogy that Lives of the Saints began. Where She Has Gone was shortlisted for Britain's Giller Prize for Fiction, and the Lives of the Saints trilogy was recently adapted for a television miniseries starring Sophia Loren, Nick Mancuso, and Chris Christopherson. Born in Leamington, Ontario, to parents from the Molise region of Italy, Ricci completed studies at York University in Toronto, at Concordia University in Montreal, and at the University of Florence, and has taught both in Canada and abroad. He is a past president of the Canadian Centre of International PEN, a writers' human rights organization that works for freedom of expression. He currently serves as writer-in-residence at the University of Windsor and as the visiting chair in religion and the arts at Assumption University's Center for Religion and Culture. Ricci's recent novel is Testament, published in 2002 in Canada by Doubleday and in 2003 in the U.S. by Houghton Mifflin. It is set in a remote corner of the Roman Empire at a moment of political unrest and spiritual uncertainty. Testament tells the story of how a holy man of enormous charisma and passionate belief alters forever the course of human history. Writes one critic for the Christian Science Monitor, quote, Ricci is a fantastic storyteller, and the 4 testimonies he's bound in Testament comprise an unsettling book, end quote. The novel was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize for Canada and the Caribbean, the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, the Pearson Canadian Reader's Choice Award, and it was the winner of the Trillium Award. Canadian author Timothy Findlay said of Ricci, he belongs on the shelf reserved for writers such as Chatwin, Ondaatje, and Flannery O'Connor. And now I introduce Mr. Ricci.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read from Testament. Louise gave a bit of an introduction to it. It's a novel that is essentially a fictional retelling of the life of Jesus, so an imagined secular retelling of that story. It's told in 4 points of view, like the New Testament. Different characters, however. One is based on the figure of Judas, one on the figure of Mary Magdalene, one on Mary, his mother, and the fourth is an invented persona, Simon, a shepherd from near the Galilee region. I'm going to read from the third section of the book, which is in the voice of his mother. Throughout the book, I use the Hebrew names for the characters. So his mother is known as Miriam, Jesus himself is known as Yeshua, and so on. Just to set this section up a bit, the mother section begins with the birth of Jesus, of Yeshua, and then takes us through various difficulties that land the family in Alexandria. In my version of the story, Jesus is illegitimate. He's a product of a rape, and the family has left Israel, or Palestine as it was then, the Roman province of Palestine, because of the disgrace that was beginning to settle on the family because of the illegitimate birth. So they're living now in Alexandria. They've been there for a number of years. Miriam's husband, Yehoseph, works as a stonemason. She has several other children. Yeshua, at this point, has left home after various difficulties, including tension with his father, Yehoseph, his stepfather, who has never really accepted him, and is essentially living in the streets of Alexandria. Alexandria, at this point in history, was a very interesting place. It was probably the first great multicultural city. It was founded by Alexander the Great about 300 BC, and subsequently became an essentially Greek city, in other words, a city of Greek culture as opposed to an Egyptian city. But it was also a meeting place for many other cultures. And at this point, it's ruled by the Romans. The Romans recently took over Egypt, so it's a Roman province. It's a spot that has had a fair number of political difficulties, including clashes between the Jews, who comprise a significant portion of the Alexandrian population, and the locals, known as Greeks, although they really are comprised of many different cultures, but essentially Greek-speaking and Greek in culture. So these two groups often clash with each other, partly because the Jews have been petitioning the Romans for equal rights as citizens, and the Greeks have been protesting these actions. So I begin with a point at which Yeshua has recently left home again for a second time and is, as I say, living in the streets. By this point, he's had a couple of teachers, one who thought he showed great promise, but whom his mother took him away from in the fear that it would create arrogance in him to be seen as someone of promise. She believes he should just keep his head low because he's illegitimate. And a second teacher, a Jewish teacher, who saw no promise in him and who Yeshua, of his own accord, left to apprentice himself instead to a Greek teacher, a man named, I believe, Artemidorus. I have to refresh my memory here a bit, who is a bit of an oddball who himself lived in the streets and preached the renunciation of all worldly goods. He was essentially a sort of Greek cynic philosopher. And Yeshua has picked up quite a bit from him and was quite attracted to him as a teacher. But he has died by this point. So this is all in the mother's voice. It was in the streets near the harbor that Yeshua kept himself. Some of these were the most wretched in the city, where there were no women except for whores, and no worship of God, it seemed, except in the prayers whispered over the gaming boards. But it was also here that every sort of wise man and scoundrel washed up, vagrants from as far as the Indus, who presented themselves as mighty wizards or priests, but often enough were the merest charlatans. Among the educated and the rich they held little sway, for these saw through their fakery. But the poor and ignorant gathered there in large numbers, including many hopeful of cures, cripples and the infertile and even lepers, who smuggled themselves into the city through the harbor or paid off the guards at the city gates. Great horrors were performed there, as I heard, abortions as well as surgeries on Jews who wished to hide their mark, and many who went there in desperation ended up cheated of their money by those who promised wonders and cures they could not deliver. I myself had been foolish enough to come at the time of the plague to seek medicines for my son Hoshea, for which I paid dearly, but to no avail. Still I found I was drawn to those streets, not only on Yeshua's account, in the hope of catching a glimpse of him, but because I had indeed seen wonders there that defied belief. For instance, there was a healer there, a surgeon, who with my own eyes and before many other witnesses, I saw revive a man from oblivion by drilling a hole in his skull. The man had fallen from a building and crushed his head, and had the surgeon not agreed to look to him, he would surely have been buried by evening. But there, before all of us, he burrowed through the man's very bone, thus releasing from his head a great quantity of water and blood, and moments later the patient opened his eyes like someone brought back from the dead. I heard tell of other such miracles, those who cured lepers, others who, with surgery, cured the blind. Whether such powers came of God or the devil, I could not say. Surely they seemed directed to the cause of good, even if there were many who were made to pay much above what they could afford, and many others who died under the surgeon's knife or under some cure that had poisoned them. But it seemed to me that there was much that was unnatural in what happened in those streets, and partook of powers that mortals should not take to themselves. It was said that in the city's schools even the corpses of the dead were butchered so that the ways of the body might be known. But I thought that the body was God's temple, and the ways of it were his mystery, and not to be understood by the likes of men. As for Yeshua, he was perhaps drawn to this quarter as any child would be, in the hope of seeing wonders. Indeed, often I thought of him next to Jacob, his brother, who, though not swift of mind, was also thoughtful enough in his way. Yet Jacob knew nothing except cutting stone, for he had worked all his life at his father's side, while Yeshua, as I imagined, had witnessed all the wonders of the world and all the horrors, for all these could be seen in that quarter of the city. There were prophets there, and those who read entrails, and magicians from Meroe who charmed snakes or even gave themselves over to their venom, falling into a trance. Then also there were performances, one heard, that could not be described. Every lewdness was practiced in them, and sometimes children or slaves were dismembered or simply murdered on the stage, all for the amusement of the spectators. These were savageries learned from the Romans with their circuses and their shows, who though they had many gods, yet were godless, for because the emperor called himself God who was only a man, therefore his citizens had lost their faith. For much of his time, I discovered, Yeshua made his living like any street urchin, running errands or working the ships of the port, or begging alms as he had with Artemidoros, though, like him, he would not take money, but only lodging and food. But he also had not lied to say he had a teacher, for indeed he had many, and often apprenticed himself for a month or 3 to this one or that, and did their business for them. To judge from how he moved from one to the other, it seemed he could not bear any of them for any great time, or that they themselves could not put up with him, for often, as I heard, he was let go for arrogance. But surely even then it might have been that he grew bored with them, or that his knowledge increased so quickly they feared it would surpass their own. Because of the market near the ships, I found sufficient reason to visit the quarter frequently. It was not hard to find Yeshua then, for he was well enough known, and I needed only to ask in the street, and soon enough he would come to me. I would have food for him, wrapped in leaves to keep it warm, which he ate in the open. We did not speak a great deal. I asked how he did, and he said well, and sometimes I offered him money, which he refused. He did not ask after Jehoshaphat or his brothers and sisters, and I did not ask the thoughts that ran through his head. Yet even then there was something between us like a grief we had shared, or a secret that had not quite been spoken. And I remembered how it had been with him when he was small, the weight I had felt settle over me in his presence. It was the weight of his own single-mindedness, it seemed to me now. I did not know what he intended for himself, or what the Lord intended for him, except that he saw that thing always visible before him, like a distant point he must reach. I imagined at first that though people knew him, he lived solitarily, for that had always seemed his nature. But I came to learn that was not the case. Indeed, there was a whole band in that quarter, children of the streets like himself, who had begun to look to him as their leader, and whom he organized to salvage food from the ships that came into port, or to choose their corner for begging, so they should not conflict with one another and slit each other's throats. So it seemed he had made a life for himself on his own, and had his family the streets to replace the one he had left. It hurt me to see this, for he had found his place among beggars when he could not in his own home. Hearing sometimes how people spoke about him in the street, the affection he was held in, and his eloquence and good humor, I had the sense he saved for me only the worst of himself. So little did the child they described seem to resemble my own. I could not have said how long we might have gone on in this way, meeting only in the streets, or if in the end his path should have so varied from mine that he would have been lost in my life. But it so happened that the troubles there had been between the Alexandrians and the Jews erupted again. There was an incident, a brawl, where a Jew killed a Greek over some slight, and then the riots began, where Jews were murdered in the streets, and those with shops outside of our quarter had them burnt to the ground. It was in the midst of this that Yeshua returned to us in the dark of night. He had somehow got caught up in the riots and taken a knife to his chest. From his pallor it was clear he had lost a great deal of blood, and it was a wonder he had made his way to us, for shortly after his arrival he fell into a swoon and did not rise again for several days. I thought then that he would not survive, and rose every morning with the same terror in me that I should find him dead. But after a time he came around. At first he was not certain where he was or how he had come to be there, and it moved me to see the need in him and his helplessness. "You have come to your home," I said, and he did not contradict me. Wounded and frail as he was, he seemed a child again, and eventually even the other children began to go to him, wondering, I supposed, that he was their brother and yet lived so differently from them. His sisters brought his food to him so he would not need to get up from his bed, and Jacob, who because of the troubles could not go to work, sat with him during the day and talked to him so unaffectedly of this and that, the jobs he had done or the doings of the quarter, that I felt my heart in my throat at how he still accepted him. Jehoshaphat, for his part, kept his silence, and because we all lived in those days in mortal fear, and every Jew looked out for every Jew, I could not imagine that he would turn Yeshua out into the street. Yeshua had said nothing of what had happened, nor had we dared to ask him. But from the talk of the quarter, we knew that a Jew had been slaughtered near the docks the night Yeshua had returned to us, dragged out from his shop by the mob, though he had lived peacefully in that part of the city for many years, and indeed had been married to a Greek. A few who had seen the thing said it beggared the mind for brutality, since the mob had been in a bloodlust and had literally torn the man limb from limb before the horrified eyes of his children and wife. Eventually we were able to learn that it was there Yeshua had received his injury, for when he was up and about, someone recognized him as one of those who had tried to stay the crowd's fury and been attacked in their turn for their pains. So the story went around the quarter that Yeshua had risked his life as a Jew, and he was seen as a hero, though still he would not talk of the thing. Among our neighbors there was surely some surprise that he should return to us in glory in this way, for after his years in the streets they had no doubt imagined him the merest wastrel. I dared to feel a mother's pride in him then, that despite the life he had led, he had still brought himself honor, though I did not know if he would leave me again the instant the troubles had ended. During that time there were many of us in the quarter who billeted in our homes those who, on account of the riots, had been forced from their own. Among the ones we ourselves put up was a young scholar of the city named Gedaliah, with whom Yeshua, as he recovered, had many discussions. Gedaliah told him the story of Pompey's capture of the temple when the Romans first conquered us, and how even as they were being slaughtered, the priests continued in their offices, valuing their allegiance to God above their own lives. So Pompey took charge of the place, and went at once to enter the most hallowed sanctuary of the Jews, the Holy of Holies, in which none but the high priest was permitted. For he imagined that vast riches lay within, and also that the great God of the Jews, for whom so many had fought so valiantly, must be represented there in supreme splendor. But to his amazement, he parted the curtain and found that the place stood empty. He understood then that our God was not some idol like those of the pagans, Gedaliah said, but so greatly surpassed any likeness we might make of him as to defy representation. The story seemed to affect Yeshua deeply. It was how my own teacher, Artemidoros, used to speak about God, he said. The riots had ended by then because the Jews had all been consigned to their quarter and forbidden to leave it. It happened, however, that a group of young Jews, still enraged at the murders that had been committed and the damage to our property, stole out of the quarter one night, though it was heavily guarded, and breached the old city wall by way of the canal. From there they set a fire just inside the Gate of the Sun, so that several buildings were burnt, including some homes. By morning the news of the fire had spread, and a mob had formed to march to our quarter to destroy us. As it fell out, it was a Sabbath that day, and we were in the assembly house near our home when the word reached us, Jehoshaphat and I and the children, and also Yeshua, who had recovered. We came out to find the streets already thronged at the news, the more so because of the many who had been driven into the district on account of the riots. Large numbers had made their way into the streets leading out of the quarter in the hope of fleeing, but had been turned back by the soldiers there, who, seeing the crowd we had formed, were loath to release us. So people thought we should be trapped there in the streets like animals and slaughtered, for no one trusted the soldiers to protect us. My own family had ended up in the great square where we held our market. It was my thought that we return to our house, where we might at least conceal ourselves and avoid the mob. But Jehoshaphat said that for all we knew our house would be burnt to the ground, and that we should stand with the rest. Many of the men had begun to arm themselves, heaving cobbles up from the pavement to use as weapons. Jehoshaphat and Jacob were quick to join them in this, helping to smash some of the larger paving stones so that the rubble from them might be used as well. But just when it seemed certain that the matter would come to violence, a teacher of the quarter by the name of Manasseh began to go around and remind us of the Sabbath, and how the Maccabees, when they were attacked on that day, did not offer resistance, but willingly gave themselves over to death. He said if we gave battle, we too would surely die, women and children along with the men, for the Greeks outnumbered us and no doubt carried weapons, and the soldiers also would turn against us. Better then that we should lift no hand and at least die innocent, and let heaven and earth bear witness, as was written in the Scriptures, that we were killed without pretense of justice. Yeshua had not yet picked up any stone. Manasseh doesn't remember that Mattathias chose to fight when he saw his brothers killed, he said to me, or the Jews would have been wiped from the earth. But still he would not arm himself. Jacob, seeing this, said, "People will look to you for your example because they think of you as a hero." But Yeshua seemed appalled at this. "Let them look to their own minds," he said. The truth was that there were many of us in the crowd, particularly among the women, who were ready to heed Manasseh's advice, not so we should be slaughtered there like lambs, but in the hopes that the soldiers, seeing us peaceful, would feel obliged to defend us. Throughout the square now there were those who had begun to take up Manasseh's call, and many of the women had turned to their husbands to try to make them see the horror of what they had undertaken. I put my own plea to Jehoshaphat, urging peace on him for our children's sake. I saw him look to Jacob then, and notice how his heart was no longer in the thing after Yeshua's reprimand. Without a word to me, he ceased his work and bid Jacob do the same. "We were wrong to merely follow the crowd instead of our conscience," he said to Jacob, which astonished me, since it seemed he deferred to Yeshua. By now those counseling peace had gained the upper hand, so that one by one people had begun to set aside their weapons. Then the word reached us that the mob had passed through the Gate of the Sun and was drawing near, and Manasseh went around saying we should sit down in the street wherever we found ourselves, to show we would make no defense. The pavement was broken up where we were, and Jacob and Jehoshaphat needed to clear some bits of rubble away before we could sit comfortably. Yeshua helped them in this. Then, when we all took our seats in the dirt, I saw Yeshua hesitate instinctively, as if it seemed forward to join us, before finally settling between me and Jacob. I could feel the heat of him next to me, and remembered, for what seemed the first time in many years, the infant he had been, and how I had held him. The strangest feeling passed through me then, having him near. We were in that crowd, my family, facing death for all we knew, Yet in that moment it hardly mattered, for we were all together. We were packed thick in the square by then, perhaps 5,000 or more, with thousands again in the streets coming off it. A silence fell over us as the last ones took their places on the ground, and there was a smell of our sweat and our fear, and our death seemed to hang over us. Then in the distance we heard the din of the mob as it approached. I thought of the problems I had concerned myself with in my life, and how little they had mattered in the end. My youngest was but 4 at the time, and I took him in my arms, and we sat and waited silent as the shouts grew closer. It was then, when our fear was greatest, that some of the women began to sing. "Sing to the Lord," they cried, "for he has covered himself in glory. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." It was a song at the sea that proclaimed our victory over Egypt. Slowly the women's words spread among us, to 10 and 20, and then across the square to the 5,000 of us, and then to the thousands more in the streets, like a fire that had spread. In the end, our singing drowned out the sound of the approaching mob and helped to put out our fear, so that even when our attackers were upon us and it was clear that the soldiers would not hold them back, at once giving way before them, we did not give up our place. From where we sat in the square, what we saw was a teeming mass that seemed to spill back in every direction, with clubs raised above it and fisted rocks and charred beams that had no doubt been taken from the site of the previous night's fire. However, seeing us in the street, making no defense and only singing, the mob did not know what to make of us. A few rocks were hurled in at us, and sticks, which because we were thick on the ground found their mark. But when still we did not move or give up our song, the mob faltered. "Lord, who is like you," we sang, "so mighty in holiness? Who like you among the heavenly powers?" And indeed it seemed to us that the Lord heard our prayer and worked a miracle then, for the soldiers, seeing perhaps that they did not have the excuse of the crowd's fury to explain their inaction, finally started to move in to disperse it. There were some scuffles, and a few of the more vicious had to be beaten back with the soldiers' sticks. But when the mob saw that the soldiers were in earnest, they began to turn away. It was not long before the bulk of them had turned back towards the city, and the soldiers had reformed their line of defense, so that even those who lingered behind could not make their way to us. For the longest time we remained sitting there in the streets, scarcely able to believe that our slaughter had been averted. Then finally we wiped our sweat and began to return to our homes. Thanks. I'll stop there. If there are any questions. Yes?
I'm assuming this is also fictional and a retelling of the original.
Well, this event is purely fictional, but it's based on sort of a historical knowledge of that city and that time. I mean, we have no evidence that Jesus ever lived in Alexandria. It's one of the theories. There are many theories out there, but that's one of the theories about how he spent those missing years. It's also a theory about, I guess, where he might have learned things that would have set him apart in an area like Galilee. Alexandria was a city of great learning, and indeed would have seemed like a different world compared to, say, a fishing village in Galilee. It was a place where people were practicing medicine at a fairly advanced level for the time. So where people were able to remove cataracts through surgery, for instance, where trepanning, or the drilling of holes in people's heads, was actually practiced as a medical practice, as a way of relieving a concussion. It was a place where bodies were dissected as studies in anatomy, all of which would have seemed like witchcraft, I guess. Alistair was talking before about circles of belief, and so there were many different circles of belief that coexisted in that world and in that time period. Similarly, the kinds of philosophies that were current in Greece and that came out of the Greek world were quite different from the kinds of philosophies you would have found in Palestine or in the Jewish world at the time. So So for me, it was a way of sort of contrasting those worlds and getting some of the larger picture into an understanding of the kind of world that Jesus would have come out of. And that particular event, there is, I don't know if you're familiar with the historian Josephus, but he's really one of the few people whose writings have come down to us from that time that give us some sense of what that area would have been like. And he actually talks specifically of a couple of events, one in particular where the Jews used passive resistance of this sort as a way of defying, in that case it was the Romans, and were successful in doing so. So passive resistance was I guess, a political technique that the Jews were aware of and that they had used. So I just sort of, as a kind of back formation, created this scene in Alexandria. Yes.
What was the biggest challenge in writing a historical fictional novel? How did you gather the information and put it into context?
Yeah. I guess the biggest challenge is finding the line between the research you put in and what you leave out. And there's always a danger that you end up putting too much in, particularly when you've done a lot of research. When I was writing this book, I spent, I guess, about 6 months just doing research. And then I started writing. And then a lot of the rest of the research I did ongoingly as I needed to learn something. I think I found that it was important to, and I've found this in other cases as well, it's important in a way to write the story without the research, to write it as it comes out. So to know enough to make that leap. You have to understand enough about that world to make an imaginative leap into that world. But once you have that, just to move forward. And the biggest thing for me really was going to Israel and sort of touring the Holy Land, or the sites of both the Old and New Testament, and getting a sense for the land. I mean, it goes back a bit to what Alistair was saying, that everything has to be set somewhere. And it made a big difference in my understanding of my characters and of my story to actually see that landscape and, be in it for a while and sort of immerse myself in that world. I mean, to see, for instance, how far the fishing village of Migdal, where Mary Magdalene would have come from, was from Capernaum or Capharnaum. To visit the sites of Capernaum, and there you can see there they have excavated houses from the first century, so you can see what these houses looked like, how people would have lived. And have a sense of what that whole world would have looked like, to be on the shores of the Sea of Galilee and just to look out and see, this whole cosmos that surrounds that lake. So that was very important. And then I did a lot of historical research. I read a lot of academic analyses of the New Testament that gave sort of historical context and textual exegesis. But it was important for me just to write the story and keep with the story, not let the research sort of burden it too much, because then the text can start to seem very heavy and more like a sociology text. I wasn't really interested in getting every detail of, well, what kind of a bowl did they eat from, or what exactly did that meal consist of, because those seemed to me details that people who lived in that time would just take for granted. They wouldn't be dwelling on them. I really wanted to sort of immerse myself in the characters, and that was the emphasis for me, was trying to understand the characters and get into their heads. But yes?
Were you concerned about I was listening to the language that you chose to use to write it and to give it a sense of, I guess, antiquity or something. Obviously you were very conscious in how you formed your sentences and stuff, or did you?
Yeah. Well, it was a big problem because, again, it's very easy to err in the wrong direction either way. If it's too modern, it sounds anachronistic and people don't buy it. If it's forcedly archaic, then it's false because, at the time, people didn't speak an archaic language. They spoke in a colloquial language. So how do you make it seem colloquial while still having that sort of veneer of age? It was a difficult balance. There's a real contrast in the novel between the Jewish voices. 3 of the voices are Jewish, and the last voice is this peasant of non-Jewish background. He's Syrian essentially, but comes out of a kind of Greek culture or kind of syncretic culture from the area. And his language is much more colloquial. So the Jewish characters, partly because I envision them having a more kind of ritualistic life, tend to have a more ritualistic language. I guess I made the language certainly more formal than I would if I was writing something contemporary, but at the same time tried to make it a bit invisible, so that by page 4 you're no longer sort of dwelling on the language. It doesn't stick out as wrong or strange. It just feels maybe a little more formal than a contemporary story would be. But yes.
You're dealing with a big story that a lot of us are familiar with. I'm wondering how aware you are of the reader. What kind of story are you trying to plant in our mind as we read it? Because I really enjoy getting the view of Jesus through Mary as an historically real person, thinking, oh my God, all this is left out in the Bible. How aware were you in this process as you went through each point of view in kind of preparing us for what little we know about Jesus? Were you tapping into what we know? Yeah. Again, sort of a balancing act in that you don't. I didn't want to write a story that just repeated what we already know, because we know that already. At the same time, if there's no point of connection, then why bother? Then it's just a completely different story. Why use those points of reference at all? So I chose a number of things that would be familiar. So in each of the 4 versions, you will hit moments where you think, oh yes, this has a resonance or this has a parallel. And in some cases, they were taking off points for whole sections. So the Mary section, for instance, I don't know how, I don't have the New Testament very present in my mind now at this point, but there is a section where when Mary first learns that Jesus is preaching in the streets in Capernaum, she assumes that he's gone mad. And she goes, I think, with one of her sons to Capernaum from Nazareth to bring him home. And he sends her away. He doesn't see her. He doesn't want to speak to her. And that seemed to me a very potent moment in the New Testament. It's a moment where he defies a basic Jewish law, honor your parents, and says outright, you're no longer my family. My followers are not my family. So it seemed an important kind of ideological moment, but also a very important emotional moment. And it seemed like almost a kind of gap where we saw something more human in the Jesus story, a real mother and son relationship, a real conflict between them. So I would look for moments like that had that kind of resonance, and try to work them in and maybe sort of open them up a bit as a way of getting into this different sort of human angle, or sort of a slightly broader angle than we get through the gospel. So those connection points are there, but they're not always the bulk of the story. They may just sort of come up here and there and resonate at some level in your mind. So you feel you're in the Jesus story, but you don't feel like it's overly familiar. It's a difficulty with material like this that people know so well, that you don't want them to feel, I know that, or I don't buy that, because they have the real version in their mind. So I just tried to sort of weave in and out in what worked for me in what seemed a credible way. And the way I suspect these stories often work, that a little bit of a thing through tradition becomes a much different thing. So trying to work back that way. Yes.
It's a very provocative storyline, and as you say, in the Bible Belt, I'm wondering if you had any kind of controversy or resistance, or what kind of feedback have you got from the religious communities?
Well, it wasn't as severe as I thought it might be. I can't really gauge in the States. I think people who don't buy this sort of thing just didn't buy this sort of thing. Just sort of ignore it unless it really hits the radar. Something like the Da Vinci Code now, for instance. Well, you have the what is the group that feels maligned? The who was it? this one, yes, very extreme sort of Catholic sect, Opus Dei or something. Yes. So that, I mean, now that, I mean, they've been sort of protesting and so on, because the book is so much in the public consciousness, then they feel they need to respond to it. If it doesn't get to that level, then it just sort of gets ignored. And in Canada, when the book first came out, and before it was even actually available, there were a number of sort of negative reactions. There were some, phone-in radio shows where people were denouncing the book, even though it wasn't yet available. There was a review in one of the papers that said, "I don't need to read this book. I know what it's like, and you don't have to read it either." So there was some of that. But in the long run, I found a lot of people in various religious communities, particularly the more sort of liberal ones. We have in Canada, the United Church. And even in the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church has its liberal wing and its Orthodox wing, and people in the more liberal wing of the Catholic Church responded, quite favorably to the book. Because despite the fact that it is an unorthodox reading, it's still it's a respectful reading of the life of Jesus. It's not an attempt to cut him down. That wasn't my intention. I saw him as a very interesting and potent figure. So that comes through in the book, and I think people responded to that in a positive way. But, yes?
Well, then I have to ask how did you feel when you thought about the illegitimacy of the thing?
Yeah.
I know that, to me, when you think about it in historical and real terms, and try to remove the mystical and the magical away from it all, does that make sense as a way to explain these things?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you were thinking about when you were drawing these ideas together. But the flee to Egypt and all sounds totally legit for those sort of social reasons of the time.
Yeah. Well, it did finally make sense. It wasn't something I invented. There is a tradition going back to the 2nd century that Jesus was the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier named Pantera, I think. I think there's a rock group also named Pantera. I don't know if they are aware of that tradition, but it was written by one of the detractors of Christianity at the time. And the only reason we even know about that tradition is because one of the fathers of the church, Origen, refuted that heresy, and in refuting it, he quoted at length from that text. The text itself was destroyed and didn't survive, except through the fathers of the church who so we're aware of that tradition. There was a tradition, there's a disputed tradition in Judaism as well, where a figure who may be Jesus appears at one point, I think, as a bastard, but there's no way of knowing whether the named figure is the actual Jesus of our tradition. So there was that tradition there to draw from. So I started thinking about it and how it might play out. And it seemed to me it played out in very interesting ways. Here's a guy who was the champion of the underdog, champion of the outsider, champion of the people who were, refused entry, in a sense, to the kingdom, who says, no, you're the first one in. And particularly with something like illegitimacy, which is a crime without a criminal. It's something within strict Judaic tradition, a bastard is not admissible in the assembly, as they say. So would forever be outside of Judaism. And I think that would hold true for his children and his children's and so on to the generation. So it seemed to make sense within Jesus' philosophy that he would be the sort of person who would say, no, that's wrong. That person can get in. So it was a way for me of making that, born out of personal experience, really. And that's sort of how it works out in a novel. There's no way of verifying that is what actually happened, but in a sense, the Gospels themselves lay out that possibility. What's Joseph's first reaction when he finds out that Mary is pregnant? She's having an illegitimate child. I have to break off the engagement. That's his first reaction. So it's And I mean, no matter how you look at it, Jesus is illegitimate because Joseph is not the father. So he's born out of that wedlock anyway. So the seed is already there. I just sort of followed it out. So, yes.
Yes, I noticed towards the beginning of the reading, you had mentioned that they had elevated their leader to godlike status, and when the leader, falls or disappoints, the people become faithless, and of course that happens at large in the world. But I was wondering if there was a specific incident that you had in mind or inspired by the modern day incidents of that, or was it specifically just in that?
Well, it was true in the Roman period that not so much in Rome itself, but in the provinces, people were essentially forced to erect temples to the Caesar, and particularly I think with Augustine, that was when it became a kind of entrenched right. Augustine's life was portrayed in very sort of godlike terms. His death was described, in terms very similar to that of Jesus, as he's described as having ascended to heaven and so on. So it was a way really of controlling the populations by making the Caesar a god. It meant he had that much more sort of emotional power over them. But there would certainly be lots of parallels. I mean, I was aware throughout the writing of this book of the parallels between that time period and our own, and I think there are a lot. It was really the first period in which world travel became common, for instance, and where there was this mixing of the cultures. It was a world in which there was one sort of strong superpower whose culture was sort of being diffused through the world. So there were some parallels that I saw with our own time in that. It was a world in which the belief was really up for grabs, and partly because the standards of beliefs were being debased. So in the Greco-Roman world, because religion had become so political, it really was a political tool for the Romans. It really left, I think, this kind of spiritual gap, and Christianity really came in and sort of filled that space. I mean, Christianity didn't succeed amongst the Jews. The Jews had a very profound faith, but that really made the Jews stick out in that world, and that was one of the reasons they were so hated or so stigmatized, was because they insisted on following their own rules, and they would put up with no master. Whereas in the rest of the Greco-Roman world, you might have a temple to Aphrodite in one spot, and then some Egyptian god in another spot, and I mean, it was just this whole mess of belief systems that were one on top of the other, with no real sort of core system of belief or center to it. So, and I mean, the parallels with today are, I think, pretty close in that regard as well. I think we're really in a moment of flux in terms of our spirituality. So yeah, I was certainly trying to make some of those connections in a distant way. But, great, thank you.